Good morning, folks. It's about 10 o'clock, and we're going to start chapter 3 today. So I'm on page 68 of your textbook, and we're going into the chapter on the cell. This will be the last chapter that we will take before we take our first lecture exam. But I'll probably divide this chapter up into 2 or maybe 3 parts. So anyway, on page 68, we're looking at the beginning chapter, or the beginning page of chapter 3, the cell. And you notice in there that in the first paragraph up top, it says humans are composed of about 10 trillion cells. It's kind of interesting that we have 10 trillion cells, and then you go look up how many bacteria we have, or viruses maybe, or fungi on us or in us, and we've got 38 trillion of those mixed on our skin and in our mouth, our respiratory tract, and so forth. So we're not alone, okay? We're not alone. Now let's look at module 3.1, and they're going to give you 4 learning outcomes. Now I want you to check off number 1, 2, and number 4. We won't get into number 4 in this today, or at least in this video. So we'll cover that a little bit later. Now, as you look down at the bottom of the page, you see it says the basic processes of the cell. In other words, what does the cell do for us? And of course, here we are with 10 trillion cells that are working together. So as you look down there at the bottom where it says basic processes, you got metabolism. You guys are probably metabolizing your breakfast this morning. And you look over on page 69 and you see transport of substances. Inside, we'll find this out a little bit later in more detail, but inside you got all kinds of activities going on in the cells. And so they transport substances throughout the cell. Did you guys ever see Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? And you remember seeing all those mechanisms moving things all around. Maybe you see Modern Marvels or How's That Made, and they show you these businesses that are making things. They've got all these machines that are in alignment, producing a product. Well, your cell does the same thing. Only the cell is probably more complicated than the chocolate factory of Willy Wonka. But anyway, they transport substances, and you see they communicate with each other. That's one of the things that helps us to respond as a person to the environment. These cells are all working together, just like a basketball team. And all these cells have different structures, different products they produce. They have different functions, but it all comes together so that we can face the environment as one. Then you see cell reproduction, and we're always reproducing cells. You know, when you got out of bed this morning, you left a bunch of skin cells, and I did too, on the sheets, because there we were sleeping in the sheets, and we pull the sheets around and move around, and cells are falling off of us. We're always losing cells, but those epidermal cells are reproducing themselves. We'll get into that when we get into chapter 5. So you got those 4 processes that cells are involved in. Now we're looking on page 169, and you come down to the overview of the cell structure. And they're going to tell you there are 3 components, and that's fine. There's a number of ways you could present this, but this is fine to do it like this. So as you look in the first paragraph, you see it talks about the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. And then they give you a little bit of a breakdown of each of those components. Your plasma membrane, as you see, you look at the second sentence under plasma membrane, it's involved with the structural support, communication with other cells, transports material into the cell, transports material out of the cell, and it's got to be under control. You just can't have things going in and out without some sort of problem. So we have control over what comes in and what goes out. We'll get into that in a little bit. They give you some terms in the second column about intracellular space, and that's, of course, that's filled with fluid inside the cell. And then you have they call it the cytosol, that's the intracellular fluid. And then you have the extracellular space, and there's fluid out there too. So you've got extracellular fluid. So the membrane's a barrier that controls what goes in and what goes out of the cell. Very important. If you disrupt that, you can create cell death. You come down to cytoplasm, and you see the cytoplasm says it's the fluid inside. You got says cytosol and the organelles that are embedded in there, along with the cytoskeleton. The cytosol is the intracellular fluid. They used to just call all of that with the organelles and the cytoplasm. They just called it cytoplasm with organelles floating around inside it. But here they want to call the cytosol is the fluid portion of the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the fluid plus all the organelles. And you see in the third sentence there, it's watery gel-like substance with a lot of proteins and different forms of nucleic acids and so forth. And you come down to where you see it says a lot of processes occur in the cytosol. A lot of chemistry is going on in that liquid. You see the term glycolytic catabolism. What does that mean? What does that term mean? Think about that. We've talked a little bit about that. Here we are applying it. And you see also glycolysis. That's another word for glycolytic catabolism. And we also produce ATP, as you see a couple of lines down. You come down to where they talk about organelles. I like the term they use there. You see the second line, it says those organelles are like molecular machines that carry out that perform specific functions within the cell, just like your heart does a particular job. It doesn't filter your blood like your kidneys do. So we, as a whole person, have all these organs inside of us that carry out a number of functions so that we can walk and talk and think and eat and sleep and so forth. Inside the cell, we have organelles, which carry out responsibilities and functions. So it's a very complicated situation, just like our body is, even when you think about the 11 organ systems. But each one of those organelles, as you read through that little chapter, it's going to tell you that it's surrounded by a membrane that's just like the plasma membrane. And that's very important to have it like that. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And you see that you come down the bottom, you see cytoskeleton. That's another component of the cytoplasm, as it says there, a network of protein filaments. We have a skeleton that gives shape to our bodies, gives points of movement where we can have muscles attached to them and the skeleton can move. Well, you've got some similar things there in the cell. And if you look on top of page 70, you see it says, not only does the cytoskeleton support the cell, but look what it says. They also function as molecular highways. Isn't that amazing? It's like substances can be transferred from one part of the cell to another along this rod-shaped protein, which is part of the skeleton of the cell. And you notice the last sentence. The cytoskeleton plays a role in movement and cell division. We'll get into that a little bit later. And then the third thing is you have the nucleus. So you got the plasma membrane, you got the cytoplasm, and you got the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, most of you know that that's sort of the headquarters. We have deoxyribonucleic acid, which is where our genes are. Our genes are made of deoxyribonucleic acid. They are the genes that make us look like we look, that help produce proteins, thousands of different kinds of proteins that go throughout the body and have specific functions. And you've also got RNA in there. So you've got those three components, and the RNA plays a role in protein synthesis, as we'll talk about later. So you've got the plasma membrane, you got the cytoplasm, you got the organelles, and you got the nucleus. So now remember, the cytoplasm has the organelles in it. So when you talk about three parts of the cell, the cytoplasm's got a lot of things floating in there. Anyway, do the quick check on 2 and 3, and then you come down to cell size and diversity. And here's where we talked a little bit at the beginning that structure and function are related to each other. So you can read through that little section and you can see the different cells. They just give you 4 examples here, one in the blood, nerve cell, epithelial cell, and the muscle. You can see there being different shapes, and the different shape is involved in the function. Little red blood cells have to squeeze through capillaries. They squeeze through. They don't roll like a tire through there. They have to squeeze through there in order to let the oxygen loose, and then they pick up carbon dioxide and bring it to our respiratory tract. They're different than the muscle cells. Muscle cells are meant to move. They're made to contract, and so we get movement. And so you got to have messages that are sent to the muscles, and that's what the nerves do. So they're all specialized in their functions, and their shape helps determine that. Now I want you to come down to module 3.2, where it speaks of the structure of the plasma membrane. And there are 3 learning outcomes. Now when you look at the structure of the plasma membrane, they describe it on page 71 as a phospholipid bilayer. It's a very interesting structure. And you, of course, check your flashbacks there. But as you come down into that paragraph, you're going to see on the 3rd line to form an effect, or on the 1st line, to form an effective barrier between the fluid outside the cell and the fluid inside the cell. I'm just using those 2 terms, but ECF is outside the cell, extracellular. Cytosol is inside the cell. And the chemicals that make up the membrane have 2 key properties. So I want you to read there. You see first, and you can read through that. And second, you can read through that all the way over to the next column. Basically, the first and the second are talking about parts of the phospholipid bilayer, how it responds to polar and polar covalent substances and ionic substances, but that doesn't react well with just covalent, nonpolar substances. So as you look down below, you see that molecule that you remember back in chapter 2. The polar head got some charge to it, and the nonpolar, which does not have that charge. So they've given you a little bit of an interesting picture. They've got some water in a test tube, and they have a phospholipid layer. Now notice that the polar heads are oriented toward water. The polar heads mean that they share electrons unequally, and that makes them have little charges on them, little positives and little negatives. The water also has that. So the polar heads like to face the water. They're hydrophilic. They like water. But watch what happens. You see the nonpolar tails tend to stick up and face the air. Now you can't see that when you look at that in a jar. You've got to have some magnification there to do that. But notice what they do in the next tube, same tube, but they put water in it, and look what happens. The layer, that single layer, splits and flips over, so now you have a phospholipid bilayer. And that helps to compose the cell membrane. So you get a little small view there. The polar heads face the water, but the nonpolar lipids don't face that water. They don't like water. They're hydrophobic. So you want to read that first paragraph and then come over to the second column and read down through the second paragraph. And then down at the bottom, you see it says this arrangement is known as the phospholipid bilayer. It helps to control what goes into and out of the cell. Let's look on page 72. And we're looking at the section called the fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane. Now, you know what a fluid is. We got all kinds of fluids, right? You drink some milk, that's a fluid. You drink some Coke, that's a fluid, and so forth. But they describe the membrane as a fluid mosaic model. Now, when you think of mosaic, some things may come to your mind. You've probably seen where people have taken different colored beans, green and black and red and yellow and so forth, and they put them together in a certain pattern, and you end up with a rooster with all these different colors. That's called a mosaic. Now, when they think about the mosaic of the plasma membrane, they give you the picture of the membrane, but they're including these proteins that float in between the heads of the phospholipids. And they're always moving. As a matter of fact, if you look at, and I want you to read the first column and the second, it'll talk about how these proteins move an average of, this is phenomenal to me, 10 million times in a second. But it's fluid and it's always moving. It's not like it's bricks with mortar between them. The shape, the little bit of the shape and the position of the proteins is always changing. And so we want to know about these proteins. And you can see them drawn there. You can see the little purple ones that go all the way through the phospholipid bilayer. You've got some that do not go through completely. You see some that look like they got an opening like this. And then you see some of these proteins that have little green structures on them. Carbohydrate chains, they would call those glycoproteins. These are proteins. The purple ones are proteins floating around. And these proteins, as you look at the top of the page, you see membrane proteins, which are the ones we're looking at that are associated with the phospholipid bilayer. You got two kinds. Come to the next paragraph and you see integral proteins, and you see they go all the way through the membrane. Peripheral proteins are found only on one side of the phospholipid bilayer. So they don't make it all the way through, but there are proteins that make it all the way through. They're embedded. And I want you to notice something too. As you look at starting down here at the right-hand lower corner, and work your way up with your finger, and you see how you got all the little phospholipid tails, got the little nonpolar tails. But as you move up past that first protein, you see the little orangey ones? Those are molecules of cholesterol. We need cholesterol. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you can see that there are glycoproteins and there are glycolipids. Glyco is a root word for carbohydrate, isn't it? And they have particular roles to play in the health of the cell. So look on page 73, and you come down this first column, and you got 6 things you want to look at. 6 functions that these proteins that are embedded to some degree or all the way through the phospholipid bilayer, they play a role. So you want to read that, and they give you a nice picture over on the right-hand side so that you see some of, as you look at 73 and you see function in that figure 3.5, some proteins act as channels so material can pass through. Some proteins act as carriers. They pick up a substance and they kick it out of the cell, or they pick up a substance outside the cell and they kick it inside. And then you see we have receptors and enzymes. And look what happens with the enzyme. Page 73, come down 1, 2, 3, 4 the blocks there. And you see the enzyme, see the 2 little substrates. That enzyme brings those 2 substrates close to each other, bonds them, and now you have a product. So we've got proteins that play a role in either dissociating substances, catabolic, or anabolic, depending upon what that protein is made to do. And then you see the structural support for the membrane, and also you see these linker proteins. They help them stay together. You break that, the cells start to come apart, and you can have some problems. So anyway, so much for those proteins. Make sure you read that. Come down to the very bottom of page 73 on the left column, and you see other membrane components. Cholesterol stabilizes. It actually helps to stabilize the structure of the plasma membrane whenever we have a temperature rise. When's the last time you had a temperature rise? Well, you think, well, when you got sick, right? But if you go out and exercise, the temperature of your body goes up. And so cholesterol helps to stabilize that. The trick is, or the challenge is, to have the homeostasis, the right amount. And you know, some of us don't have it. We got a problem. The body's not perfect. And so we can have too much of that cholesterol and creates a problem for us. On page 74, you look at the first column and you come down to this paragraph that talks about the 2 final components that we've already mentioned, glycolipids and glycoproteins. I want you to read through that. Some of those play a role in cell recognition. Cells recognize other cells, just like you recognize people in your family. If somebody comes up to the door and knocks on it, and you don't recognize them, well, your receptors here have told you this person doesn't live here. What do you want? What can we do for you? Same thing is true with these cells. They recognize the ones that they should be with. And this mentions in here how the sperm recognizes the egg. That's how it does it. It's got some proteins on its surface, glycolipids or glycoproteins that help them recognize they're at the home base and they need to get it together with that egg. When you have a transplant, these are some of the proteins that they try to match up. When they say we found a match, that doesn't mean it's a perfect match. Doesn't mean that. Just means that we try to get the ones that create the biggest rejection matched up. Okay? So I want you to read that and, of course, do the quick check down there. They ask in number 3, what are the 5 functions, but they listed 6 on the previous page, so maybe they overlooked that whenever they made the newer edition. Now, the next section deals with transport. This is module 3.3, transport across the membrane. And we've been here for about 25 minutes, so I'm going to shut it down right now, and later this afternoon I'll make another one. And you usually have to wait 24 hours to get that into your pockets tomorrow, so I'll get another one a little bit later. Okay? Y'all have a good lunch, and I'll get back later. Bye-bye.